This is the Women of Wonder podcast, where we help women tap into their superpowers.
Thank you for joining us on this next episode of the Women of Wonder podcast. Really excited for our guest here today. And for those of you who are just joining us for the first time, Women of Wonder is a podcast and a community focused on helping women tap into their superpowers. So, Taylor, I have to start things off here by asking you, what would you say is your superpower these days?
I think my superpower is my willingness to keep experimenting. And I guess the other side of that is I'm very value-centric, vision and value-centric. So I can hold where I'm going. And then I'm getting better and better at being okay, I tried this path. This wasn't the path to get there. Let's try another path.
Great. I like that. And I'm sure we're going to dive into that in our conversation today. So I met Taylor Morrison actually when she was demonstrating some of her superstar facilitator skills at one of her corporate clients. And Taylor is also a coach, the CEO and founder of Inner Workout, and has recently launched a very exciting book that I absolutely adored, and I know that all of you will as well. So Taylor, you really do stretch across, many different facets of work, but I'm curious, how would you define the work that you're doing today and bringing to the world?
Yeah, whenever I try and sum it up in one line, I keep coming back to this idea of developing leaders who care. So you mentioned the different facets of what I do. At my core, I'm a writer, I'm a facilitator, I'm a coach, I'm a speaker. And whether I am working with people to develop their skills as a presenter, a facilitator, or working with one-on-one clients to help them understand how they can integrate care into their lives, there's this through line of care and intention and thoughtfulness, both for yourself, but also for the people that you're interacting with in your personal and professional life.
Very beautifully said, and something I can tell you've spent some time thinking about. So I appreciate that. And I'm glad you mentioned care. I'd like to actually touch on that before we go any deeper here. You talk a lot in this book about self-care and kind of what sounds like a newer definition when we're coming from a world where it seems like you have to buy a new product every week or do some type of service. And there's a lot of this external motivation for what self-care looks like. Would you mind walking us through what your definition is and how it applies to Inner Workout?
Yeah. So the definition that I use in the book and in the company is that self-care is listening within and responding in the most loving way possible. And what that definition and that shift in mindset did for me is it moved self-care from this list of things that I'm supposed to be doing all the time that many times I wasn't prioritizing. So it's this often a list of things that I felt like I was supposed to be doing, but then I felt bad because I wasn't doing them, into an ongoing conversation that I'm having with myself. And I feel like that shift from self-care as a task to self-care as a conversation just opens up so much possibility that my self-care will look different than your self-care, that my self-care today might look different than my self-care tomorrow. And it gave me so much more breathing room. And I really, really needed that.
And how did that come to be? How did you come to realize this shift and what you needed in terms of self-care?
Yeah, it really came from personal experience. I'm not someone who, it's funny because people will talk to me and they'll be like, your voice is so grounding, your voice is so calming. But my internal landscape tends to be really anxious. And my default setting is very achievement oriented. And I realized over time that those mindsets and ways of moving in the world weren't serving me. And they also weren't allowing me to have the type of impact that I wanted to have in the world. I kept burning myself out. And so when I had to really just have some honest conversations with myself about like, how are we showing up and what is the life that we're building? Because if you're burning out all the time, then the life that I built and had built at that time wasn't a life that was sustainable for me to live in. And so as I started doing my own work and exploration, I realized, oh, what I'm doing is I'm listening to myself and I'm finding loving responses. And yes, that might be like me taking a bath on Sunday nights, but it also is changing how I'm interacting with myself and with others at almost every point of my day.
And how does this translate into the corporate space? You know, I come from the corporate world, and I also have seen what it's like to be outside of the corporate world. And I think there's a lot of people that this is just not a practice for. And, you know, we do recognize and reward a lot of that high performance, anxiety ridden type of result orientation within the workplace. How do you apply some of these concepts to people that maybe haven't had these conversations with themselves and done that level of reflection?
Yeah, I think there's two ways to look at this. So in the book, I talk about like the ecosystems of care. And a lot of the work that I focus on is on individuals, especially in the book, because we can only control ourselves. So that's when the conversation I end up having with a lot of individuals is like, okay, what time, what resource, what interests do you have that are available to you right now? And instead of making a plan for you to meditate for an hour a day, let's find the minute that you have and celebrate the fact that you can spend a minute. So a lot of times with individuals, it's just realizing like, you have time. How can we be intentional about this? And how can we not shame ourselves for what we think we should be doing? We think we should be doing more. The conversation that I'm having more and more with leaders is, how can we create space? And it's so interesting. Right before this, I was looking through a Deloitte report on well-being in the workplace, and they were talking about like, what are the drivers that support well-being in the workplace? And I feel like if you would pick a person off the street who works in corporate America and say like, how do you do well-being in the workplace? They'd be like, I don't know. We have meditations, or we like, I don't, maybe I have access to a coach or an EAP where there's a therapist. And what this Deloitte study found was that it's leaders who are leading in a way that allows you to be well. It's thinking about the ways that we approach our work. So tackling topics like false urgency. Why are we making everything urgent when it's not? And thinking about like how we work and how we set up our work so that we can focus, so that we're not switch tasking all the time. So within that, there are definitely things that you can do as an individual, but it's so much easier if your leader in your organization is acknowledging, okay, yeah, maybe this thing that a client wants is actually not something that we have to drop everything to address in 2 hours. That was a little bit of a ramble, but there's the two sides,
the
individual and then the systemic or the organizational.
And I'm so glad that you said that, because it's clear that the leaders have to lead by example and what it means to be in self-care and to set boundaries. And it's interesting that you mentioned this, because I was on the train this morning and someone was talking about this study on a podcast I was listening to. And he said, like, maybe there's a lot of leaders out there that are used to sending text messages at 11 o'clock on a Saturday night. And there's this endurance culture that some people can perform in, but you cannot expect an entire organization to be able to follow suit without burning out. And the risk and the amount of resource that takes then to try to get those people back into the rhythm is, I mean, you probably know these numbers a lot more than I do, but I can imagine that there's a huge cost to a business when someone has to take a medical leave or, isn't able to really be at the capacity that they would for their typical work days and weeks. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, there must be something in the water that we both
right?
were engaging with that today.
Yeah. And I do a lot of like next, but this one felt really important and clear. So I like that. Um, One standout tidbit that you had in the book was around Kid Cudi and humming. I have to ask, can you share what that's all about and what that supports?
Yeah. So the book is broken up into these 5 dimensions of well-being that are inspired by this yogic concept of the kosha and the koshas. And in the energetic dimension, it's looking at how we work with energy in our daily lives. A lot of that is thinking about how we breathe and how we support ourselves, as well as like there is a finite amount of energy in the world and in our days. And so every part of the book has these different practices. And I was like, well, I don't want to just put like a normal breathwork practice. So I was digging into the research and I was like, I know humming is good for you. And it is. Humming can do a lot for you in helping you shift your energy. And I happen to know that some people, because sometimes I spend too much time on Twitter, are obsessed with Kid Cudi in the way that he hums in almost every song, which if you think about it, there's a lot of songs that he hums in. And so I kind of had him as a source of inspiration for reminding ourselves that when we do something that can seem so silly, like humming along to a song, can actually be this really grounding practice that is allowing us to engage with both our physical body and our energetic body in a different way. And yeah, if you're not sure where to start, just go on Spotify, play a Kid Cudi song, hum along when he starts humming, and you're good to go.
I love it. It's so practical and fun. And I might have tried it yesterday when I was walking home by myself, and it felt good, I have to say. So yes, great opportunity to share something like that. So you, before we jumped on this call, shared that you had this really busy season with launching the book, traveling, and now you're coming to a place of a bit more stillness. How do you manage these cycles that you go through just through your output of work or the seasons or other things that impact you on a cyclical basis?
I think the first thing is really observing what my cycles are. So like I'm into knowing what's happening with my menstrual cycle. As we're recording this, we're pretty early into spring. I live in Chicago. There's like, it is very clear when it is winter and when it is spring and when it is summer. And more, I've been trying to incorporate seasons into the way that I do business and making sure that I take what I call integration breaks. So like for the first podcast that I launched in 2019, I did it every single weekday of 2019. And then in 2020, it became twice a week. And then I eventually became once a week. And then with very little break. And I eventually started a new podcast, but I was in this cadence of like everything that I do has to be weekly. And there are still some parts of my business that are weekly. I still have right now 2 weekly newsletters, but one that's been weekly for about 4 years. And I just had to question, like, does everything have to be this regular cadence? And where can there be room for breaks, especially if I'm not feeling as connected to something? So that's what I try to do, is notice where is something starting to feel like an obligation, and can I get either clear on the intention and reconnect to that, or switch the way that I'm doing it. It kind of gets back to what I said, my superpower is like, I know that I love podcasting. I love it as a pretty accessible way to disseminate information. So I was clear that I wanted to keep doing it, but I was also clear that the way that I was doing it wasn't working anymore. So I switched it to a seasonal format, which gives both me and the listener space to like integrate the knowledge. And I try to do that in my work life as well. Like I just did a big planning session for myself, and I'm like, okay, what is everything I want to get done this quarter? Then I'm prioritizing it. And then I'm fitting in and mapping on my calendar, like, when is the actual dedicated time that I can do this? And can I make sure that I have plenty of margin so that like this already happened. There's an RFP that I want to respond to, but because I had margin, I can play around with that. It doesn't even always have to be work related. Sometimes it's like, oh, I want to take this fun course. Great. I have room in my calendar. So I guess the TLDR of that is like noticing what is going on in your life, noticing how you're responding to it. It's that listening and loving response again of self-care, making shifts as needed, clarifying as needed, and then making sure that there's space for the unexpected, which like for me is super important. I like to feel like I can say yes to opportunities that I didn't even know were coming my way because I gave myself time.
It's great. And a good reminder to have that proactivity approach and really based on what you're noticing in yourself. So thank you for sharing that. You mentioned your cycle, like menstrual cycle. I'm curious how you adapting to even just having the cycles of being a woman has changed and shifted over time. I noticed you referencing a really close connection to your own energy bodies in the book.
Yeah. I'm not really sure how exactly I started being interested in it. Like, I guess theoretically in health, I learned that there's like 4 phases of your menstrual cycle. And then I probably read something and then was like, oh, yeah. And this past year, I got diagnosed with PMDD. So it was so interesting, even over years of being aware of my cycle, I didn't realize that like the way I experience luteal phase isn't the normal way, quote unquote, of people experiencing luteal phase. And what I think it's done is it's given me a lot of permission to have seasons where like I feel so energized and I can get so much done. It's often when I'll build big frameworks for the business, do big creative projects for myself. And then also have times where it's like, the only things I need to do right now are read or edit or do things that take a little less brain power or use a different skill set of myself, and allowing that to be okay. Like this week, I'm writing all of my newsletters for Inner Workout for the rest of the month because like that's the energy that I have right now.
Mm-hmm.
And then when words just don't work in my brain later this month, past me already took care of that version of me who just needs to like rest and edit.
Very wise. And even just playing on the cycles piece, I'm curious how your relationship to being a woman has changed in the recent years.
I think I am just more aware of what it looks like for me to own my womanhood. Especially as a woman who's a leader, I realize the way that I lead and how I motivate people as both a woman and as a Black woman is often outside of the leadership paradigms that we may have seen represented, whether that's in the organization that you work at or even just like what you see represented on TV. And I think for a while I would be like, I'm a little softer spoken. I look younger than I am, and just feeling like I need to make people take me seriously. I need to prove myself. And I'm just really not interested in doing that anymore. And it's really fun to just be like, this is how I show up. Like you can take it or leave it. And to see the clients, both like organizational and one-on-one clients who are drawn to that. Like the more I own who I am and how I lead, the more people are attracted. And also the other side of that is like the more people are repelled. But the people that it's attracting is great. Like it's so aligned. I'm having these conversations where I'm like, oh, you get it. We are headed towards the same place. And when I'm trying to model this type of leadership that is rooted in systems and structures that have oppressed people that look like me for a long time, it feels oppressive. And then it ends up attracting people that I don't want to work with.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. For you, one thing that I noticed, and I hadn't gathered this from what I knew from you, was your interest in assessments. And I learned a lot from you and just like the different types of assessments that you've utilized. And I'm curious if you could share, what assessments are still relevant for you these days. And one in particular that stood out was human design.
Yeah, we can talk about. So human design has been a whole journey for me. I guess, first of all, I talk about in the book how I view assessments as conversation starters. I think it's a strength overused as a weakness. So they have this power for us to get to know ourselves and to be like, ooh, I agree or I don't agree with them. But we humans are like, oh, I can get 4 letters and know everything there is to know about a person. And it's like, no, that's not how it's meant to be. So any like assessment, any archetyping system, I like to engage with them and see, how does this fit into what I know of myself? And how does this perhaps add a different perspective that I hadn't named or thought of before? So human design, for those who aren't familiar, it's definitely more of a spiritual archetyping system. Like it includes your astrology and all of these different pieces together. It's been very interesting. I think this is one of the ones where I took it too literally. I allowed it to be the conversation instead of a conversation starter. And that was to my detriment. So there are these different types and there's different strategies. I'll talk to mine because that's what I know. So I'm a generator and my strategy is supposed to be to respond. And I was just talking about this with someone else who is also a generator, where we're like, how do we, like, opportunities just come to us and you have to get really good at saying yes or no. I'm an emotional authority, which means that like I want to say yes to everything often, or I get caught up in the moment. And then I got to be like, whoa, let me give myself a couple of days before I say yes. So it's about responding, and we tend to be like very magnetic, but that can also be because we have so much, like, I do a lot. One of my friends says that my superpower is like getting stuff done. She's like, GSD, getting stuff done. That's like Taylor's superpower. And sometimes people can see that and want to like have me plug into whatever it is that they're doing. And if I'm not aware, if I'm not boundaried, all of a sudden I'm expending my energy on all these things that like I don't care about. So the responding is really important. And when I think about my best business successes and personal successes, it's been me noticing that something's happening, having people either directly ask me or repeatedly tell me in feedback, like, we need this thing. And then I respond and it's like, oh my gosh, you read my mind. Where I went wrong with that is that part of the response is also responding to what is energizing me in the moment. And I had this period of time where I felt very beholden to responding to what other people wanted. And I prioritized what they wanted in responding to that over responding to my energy around something. And so now I'm making the shift where I still see how human design and the strategy of responding can be so useful, but I allowed it to be about just doing what other people wanted instead of also honoring and responding to myself, which, yeah, when you take an assessment or an archetyping system too literally, that's how it can become limiting.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, because I don't think we hear about that dark side of it very often, where people are limiting themselves. And I am a manifester, so I'm attracted to generators and manifesting generators, because I'm like, I need to go and have a nap now. Like, thank you very much for continuing, but I need to take that creative rest. So yeah, I get it from the other side when I see the different types of people and how that fuels their work styles and their ability to create. So thank you.
And if I can, I'll add one thing there that you said that
yes.
I think is really important. One of my clients that I've worked with for the longest time is also a manifester. And what I think can be really useful about these systems, if nothing else, it reminds you that people work differently and it gives you a shared language. So when I'm working with my client who's a manifester, I'll say, this might be through my lens as a generator. This is how I approach it. You might need to filter this through differently. And it just is this reminder that people have different levels of energy, different needs to rest. Rest looks and feels differently to people. And when used well, it can be this reminder that like we all have so much to offer the world. And in order to do it sustainably, it's all going to look a little bit different for each person.
Absolutely. Community. I'm curious about your thoughts around, the significance of community and how it's impacted the work that you've done.
Community is like everything. As I have thought about having this book out in the world, and I've talked so much about self-care for years, I am starting to expand in wanting to talk about care, which encompasses self-care and community care, because in many ways, self-care is not possible without community care. And also, I've been really obsessed with Dr. Michael Unger's work around resilience. I just completed a certification that he taught. And when he talks about resilience, he sees two sides of it. And the side that gets talked about in popular culture is what he calls like the rugged traits of resilience. So the things that I can do to bounce back and be stronger and have grit. But the other side that doesn't get talked about as much, which shows up a lot in his research and how he works around resilience, is resources, which is, yes, money and time, but also people. And we forget that in order to be resilient, in order to feel well cared for, there is only so much that we can do on our own. We need each other. We are designed to relate to and to engage with and to exchange with other people. And so the last thing that I want is for us to be doing our self-care practices from this siloed place that separates us from other people, when we're really living what I would call like a care-filled life. It is bringing us into deeper relationship with others. And I don't always see that happening in the mainstream. I can see it getting really focused on like, here's my practice, here's what I do, and this is how it serves me. And I can fall into that too. I'm calling myself out right now.
I'm glad I asked, because that's such a great reminder and a strong message in the value of community. So as we're starting to wrap things up here, I'm curious if there are, any final bits of wisdom that you'd like to share while we're together today.
Yeah, I think something that's been on my mind a lot is how can we talk about these things as practice, like a self-care practice, or even like leadership in practice. So how can you take these things that you are learning and know about yourself and make sure that you are integrating them, you're embodying this knowledge in your daily life, especially for the people who are leading here, who are people leaders, you're leading other people. Think about, how are you operationalizing care in the way that you work, both for yourself, but for other people. I've seen it really well. I get to do some work with Google, and even I've watched this team shift language where now they'll start talking about false urgency and be like, hey, I have a request, no false urgency here. Can you get this to me by XYZ date, which is normally days, if not over a week out. And that's come from leadership demonstrating like, hey, we're not going to unnecessarily rush things. But you can also operationalize it for yourself. How are you making sure that you have at least a moment where you can hear from yourself? The last thing that I want is for people to just listen to this and be like, oh yeah, like self-care. Oh yeah, do things for yourself, and then have it go in one ear and out the other. Like, what is one way? And even if you have to pause right now, what is one way that you can integrate this into your life today? At least try, experiment with it.
Paused, thinking. Taylor Morrison, inner workout, everyone go and grab this because there's some incredible exercises and ways to really reflect on this topic. So thank you very much for being here today, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much for having me.